Prepare for an unforgettable adventure that leads right into the heart of interstellar intrigue. One of the most intense moments happens when the unsuspecting human hero stumbles onto a secret coup in the Dravarian bunker, where plasma blasts, swirling smoke, and the fate of an entire empire hang in the balance. Want to discover how the Royal Sisters unite their warrior training and scientific genius to confront an impossible threat? Or how the chaotic first meeting between a lone Terran engineer and two alien princesses transforms into something that shakes the galaxy. Stay with us to hear the full journey, because you won't believe how all these twists resolve until you've heard it from start to finish. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll help support more thrilling sci-fi tales, romantic adventures, and unbelievable stories waiting just around the cosmic corner. Zachary Cole exhaled a slow, tense breath as he guided his battered starship through the swirling magenta clouds above Arvina 7. After years of serving in the Terran Special Forces, he thought he had experienced every variety of planetfall imaginable. Yet the approach to Arvina's mountainous capital region felt different. Despite the planet's unassuming name, countless rumors depicted Dravarian architecture as some of the most extravagant in the galaxy, ranging from floating crystal spires to shimmering plazas that reconfigured themselves overnight. As Zach's vessel descended, he began to see hints of that legendary design. Flickers of violet light, vast dome structures, and winding roads that glistened with an almost liquid sheen in the planet's thick atmosphere. He was here for one purpose only: a straightforward repair job on a damaged quantum propulsion system belonging to the Dravarian Royal Fleet. His credentials as an ex-Special Forces operative and licensed quantum engineer often landed him in politically charged territories, but he made a habit of keeping his head down. In the cockpit, the ship's AI confirmed local clearance codes. Zach repeated the standard greeting in Dravarian, hoping he had the intonation right. The official language of Arvina 7 was notoriously nuanced. He could easily transform a polite introduction into an embarrassing insult with a single mispronunciation. As the ship's thrusters cycled down, the artificial gravity generators of the Dravarian capital came online. The abrupt shift made Zach's teeth clench. He had read about how the Dravarians like to layer extra gravity wells for security, something about making it harder for enemies to deploy ground troops or evade the guards patrolling the city's perimeter. When the landing struts finally locked onto the designated pad, he was met by an unexpected turbulence in the local weather system. Clouds of swirling purple sand eddied around the hull, and sudden arcs of plasmic discharge crackled overhead. "Just a routine fix," Zach mumbled to himself, trying to ignore the uneasy twist in his gut. "Patch the quantum drive, get paid, and get out." He saw no point lingering any longer than necessary. One rumor he kept hearing about Arvina 7 was the labyrinthine legal system, especially regarding the Dravarian nobility. Unverified stories told of travelers winding up entangled in baffling local regulations for the smallest infractions. So his plan was to steer clear of trouble and depart as quickly as possible. He stepped down the ramp, tool bags slung over one shoulder, and found himself in a sprawling spaceport terminal. Dravarian citizens, their skin ranging from pale lilac to a deep indigo hue, bustled around him in graceful yet hurried movements. Tall robes made from a fabric that gleamed like living crystal fluttered as they navigated security scanners and gate checkpoints. A loud digital chime announced the arrival of a regal shuttle at a nearby platform. Zach paused just long enough to watch, curiosity briefly surpassing caution. The Dravarian royalty were rumored to be imposing figures, rumored to command fear or reverence in equal measure. Turning away, Zach joined the main thoroughfare, weaving through knots of travelers. Even though humans were not entirely unknown in this part of the galaxy, he still drew stares from the throngs of Dravarian citizens. Some gave him polite space as though uncertain whether to greet him, while others looked intrigued by the human's stocky build and short-cropped, dark hair, physical traits seldom seen on Arvina 7. Zach tried to ignore their interest, focusing instead on the overhead signage that flickered with Dravarian script. He needed to locate the city's central customs checkpoint to finalize his engineering credentials and officially register his presence. Yet as soon as he found the sign leading to customs, the crowd around him surged backward. Shouts rippled through the terminal. "The royal procession! Move aside!" someone cried. The flow of bodies jostled him off balance, and his worn combat boots skidded on the frictionless flooring. Grunting, he attempted to regain his footing, but felt an unexpected gravitational fluctuation. "Is the gravity failing?" he muttered in alarm, just before momentum pitched him forward. His arms flailed desperately for something to grab onto. Unfortunately, that something ended up being two Dravarian women in the midst of an official ceremony. Time seemed to warp in that brief second of collision. Zach's shoulder collided with something surprisingly soft, one of the women's ceremonial robes, and he let out a strangled yelp as he tried to brace himself. His left hand landed on a slender waist, and his right hand, to his utter horror, found purchase on a place that no civilized person would ever intentionally grab in public. He went sprawling across the polished tiles, taking both women down in a tangle of limbs. Around them, Dravarian citizens recoiled in shock, creating a wide ring of onlookers. Zach's face burned with embarrassment as he scrambled to untangle himself. The first woman, taller and clad in intricately etched armor that shimmered with kinetic energy, clenched her jaw in outrage. The second woman, shorter and sporting a sleek visor that displayed a cascade of digital readouts, managed to keep a surprising composure, though her lips twitched with amusement behind an annoyed scowl. "You dare!" the armored Dravarian hissed, her tone electric with fury. "I am Cyrilla, first daughter of Empress Demera." Her gloved hand hovered over the hilt of a ceremonial sword that glowed with a faint purple hue. Zach raised his palms in surrender. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I lost my footing, the gravitational shift. I didn't mean—" He trailed off, glancing from Cyrilla's expression of simmering rage to the second woman. She stood a few steps back, adjusting the luminous visor perched above her delicate Dravarian features. "It looks like he tripped in the flux field," she remarked. "I'm Isella, second daughter of Empress Demera, and I'd very much like an explanation of how you ended up with your hand there." Before Zach could offer any explanation, the second woman winced and touched her visor as though scanning some kind of data. Meanwhile, a third Dravarian woman, this one with richly embroidered robes and regal posture, joined them, her gaze traveling slowly from Zach to the two princesses. This must have been the so-called third daughter, though she was slightly older than the other two and wore an expression that blended reluctant tolerance with a steely sense of authority. "I'm already spoken for," she snapped, though her voice held less venom than Cyrilla's. "Count yourself lucky for that." Zach had barely sorted out which daughter was which when a thunderous voice boomed from behind the onlookers. The crowd parted with a reverential hush. Striding toward them was Empress Demara herself, adorned in a resplendent cloak that shimmered as though woven from starlight. Dozens of palace guards followed, each armed with advanced energy lances. Zach's heart pounded. Rumor spoke of Demara's cunning in both warfare and politics. Even the Terran outpost recognized her name. The Empress's severe gaze flicked down at the scene. Her daughters disheveled, a foreign engineer on the floor, and the entire terminal in an uproar. "Explain, human," she commanded, her voice as cold as deep space vacuum. "Why do you lay hands on two of my unmarried daughters?" Zach jumped to his feet, attempting to sound as diplomatic as possible. "Your Majesty, it was an accident, an unintentional collision caused by the gravitational anomalies in this sector of the spaceport. I had no intention." Cyrilla drew her sword an inch from its sheath. "Intentions matter little," she growled. "Dravarian law is clear about unauthorized physical contact with a princess." Isella's visor flared with swirling data, and she tapped the side of it. "Our law is extremely specific, in fact," she murmured, speaking more to the Empress than to Zach. "It states that if someone makes direct, intimate contact with a royal daughter who is not yet pledged, it constitutes a formal marriage proposal, if that contact is improper." Her eyes flicked to the mortified human, which in this case it most definitely was. Zach's mind raced. He had heard whisperings of Dravarian customs being archaic, but he never imagined they would interpret a clumsy mishap as grounds for marriage. "Look," he said, trying to keep panic from his voice, "there must be a more reasonable solution. I can pay a fine or offer a formal apology." "Silence," Empress Demara snapped. Her eyes bored into his. You touched both Cyrilla and Isella. The law is unequivocal. Unless you choose the path of refusal, you are bound by betrothal to both. A hush fell over the terminal. Even the guards shifted in discomfort, as though the very notion of a dual betrothal was extreme by Draverian standards. Zack felt his throat constrict. Two princesses? A man who had arrived merely to fix a quantum drive was suddenly on the brink of an interstellar scandal. Cyrilla, face flushed a dark indigo with anger, spoke first. Mother, I protest. We do not need a human consort, especially not one who collides with royal processions. Her hand still lingered on her sword. There must be an exception. Draverian law is older than any single ruler, Damara said, unyielding. To deny its edicts publicly would set a dangerous precedent. Would you prefer your new husband be executed? Isella glanced sidelong at her sister, her expression less wrathful and more curious. That would certainly solve the immediate problem, she said dryly, but might create diplomatic fallout. Humans have allies, do they not? She turned to Zack, letting her visor fade into a translucent overlay. Your people might consider such an execution an act of hostility, could lead to tensions. Zack swallowed. Yes, I'd very much prefer to avoid that outcome. But isn't there an option to flee? He disliked the notion, but recalled hearing that refusing Draverian law often meant becoming a fugitive, subject to a bounty. Damara's lips curved in a cold smile. That is your other choice. To run. However, you will be declared an enemy of the royal house. Draverian bounty hunters and our entire network of mercenaries would track you across the galaxy. You would never be truly free. So my options are forced marriage, execution, or a lifetime of running, Zack concluded, grimacing. This was without question the most insane predicament he had ever encountered. Worse still, he had done nothing but trip over his own boots. Cyrilla narrowed her eyes, turning to her sister. Well, Isella, do you want to share a husband? Isella huffed, but there was a note of reluctant amusement in her voice. It's not my first choice, but the law is the law, and it might offer a chance for interesting research on human physiology. When she caught Zack's horrified expression, she gave a shrug that was almost apologetic. I'm a scientist, among other things. Empress Damara gestured to her guards. Escort him to the palace. Prepare for the ceremony at once. Her voice rose with regal authority. By tomorrow we shall have unity, or retribution, and you, human, do not make the error of underestimating the seriousness of this arrangement. Zack's protest was cut off by heavily armored guards seizing his arms. Before he could fully comprehend the consequences of this bizarre twist of fate, he was marched away under the watchful gazes of his new prospective brides and their imperious mother. He found himself half wishing the quantum drive repair job had never come his way. So much for a simple paycheck. Now he was facing a royal wedding that no sane man would wish for, at least not under these circumstances. The palace soared above the city like a fortress of amethyst, its spires piercing the sky and glinting in the golden twilight. Zack was hustled through grand corridors that seemed to shift hue, depending on the angle of the overhead lighting. At intervals, he glimpsed open-air courtyards filled with exotic flora, shimmering fountains, and faintly glowing sculptures. He might have admired the architectural marvels under different circumstances, but now his mind churned with worry. The guard detail deposited him in a lavish suite dominated by walls of translucent crystal. A faint hum of energy told him that the entire place was under constant surveillance, possibly with hidden sensors to track his every move. Stay here until the matrons arrive, one guard informed him, voice echoing off the glassy walls. No sooner had the guards left than three stern-faced Draverian matrons swept into the suite, each draped in elaborate fabrics edged with gold filigree. They introduced themselves as the ceremonial council, the officiants responsible for grooming him in the royal tradition. One of the matrons, a woman named Rima, pointed at a raised pedestal built into the floor. You will stand there for the official cleansing, she said. Zack frowned. Cleansing? You must be purified before the wedding ceremony, Rima explained with all the warmth of a computer terminal. Please remove your garments. Look, I appreciate your customs, but can't we? Garments, she repeated. A second matron tapped at a control panel, and Zack felt a shimmer of energy through the floor, reminding him that resistance was pointless. Sighing, he stripped down to the short underlayer of his flight suit, which they then insisted he remove as well. His cheeks burning with embarrassment, he complied. The cleansing process involved standing under a beam of fluorescent light that crackled with intangible static. He felt bizarre pinpricks across his skin, followed by the faint smell of ozone. Next, the matrons draped him in Dravarian formal robes, an iridescent fabric that clung to him with surprising comfort, changing color as he moved. If the situation had been less harrowing, he might have admired the artistry. "We will conduct a brief orientation in Dravarian etiquette," another matron, Orla, informed him, her expression unyielding. "Should you violate protocol during the marriage rites, it will bring catastrophic dishonor. Not just to you, but to Empress Damara's house. That would be unwise." Zach managed a polite nod, thinking how surreal it all felt. Less than 2 hours ago, he was an independent contractor expecting a quick job. Now he was dressed in alien finery, about to undergo a wedding with not one but two Dravarian princesses. He wondered if his old Special Forces buddies would ever believe this story if he made it home. The orientation was exhausting, involving over a dozen archaic gestures, formal kneeling patterns, and precise Dravarian phrases he was supposed to recite without error. Each mispronunciation triggered a stern correction from the matrons. By the time they finished, Zach felt as though he had crammed an entire cultural encyclopedia into his head. Only then did Rima mention the vow he would speak to confirm the union. "It consists of 20 stanzas," she said gravely. "You must recite them from memory." His stomach tightened. 20 stanzas in an alien language? By tomorrow? Orla's expression remained impassive. "You are the one who touched two princesses in front of half the spaceport. Now you pay the price. You will have a single chance. Do not fail." If Zach's nightmarish predicament had not sunk in before, it did now. A swirl of dread settled in his chest, imagining the fiasco if he botched the vow. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and resolved to do whatever it took to avoid immediate execution, or the indefinite manhunt that awaited him otherwise. Morning arrived on Arvina 7 with dramatic flair. Distant mountain peaks glowed under a sky swirling with magenta clouds, while the palace seemed alive with a subdued tension. Zach barely slept, having spent most of the night rehearsing the Dravarian vow. He kept stumbling over certain guttural consonants that Dravarian tongues formed effortlessly, and every time he got it wrong, an automated practice system chirped at him. Exhaustion tugged at his eyelids, but the fear of failure spurred him on. He had no idea how Cyrilla or Isella felt about their impending forced marriage. His only interactions with the princesses so far had been disastrous. Cyrilla's scowl when he was carted off the previous evening suggested she would rather face a hungry raptor beast than wed a human. Isella, on the other hand, seemed intellectual and curious, but that hardly meant she welcomed this union. For all he knew, Dravarian law might be pushing them into a situation they despised as much as he did. "Time to go," one of the matrons announced sharply, gesturing for him to follow. They led him through a labyrinth of corridors decorated with murals depicting Dravarian victories in ages past. Grand columns rose to vaulted ceilings, where shards of crystal refracted light into dancing patterns. Every corner felt steeped in centuries of tradition and unbending authority. Eventually, they reached a massive set of doors inlaid with swirling metal filigree. A hush fell over the entourage. Beyond those doors lay the grand ceremonial hall. The double doors swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a colossal chamber filled with Dravarian nobility, all in rows of elevated seating that surrounded a wide dais. The air was thick with tension and scented with floral incense. Standing near the center of the dais were Cyrilla and Isella. Even in his anxious state, Zach couldn't help but notice their striking appearances. Cyrilla wore imposing ceremonial armor, polished to a mirror-like sheen, with a short cloak trailing behind her arm. The faint hum of an energy sword latched at her side hinted at her prowess as a warrior. Isella's attire was more subdued yet still brimming with Dravarian elegance, her sleek visor replaced by an ornate circlet that displayed shifting lights, a symbol, he guessed, of her role as a royal scholar or innovator. Empress Damara presided, wearing a magnificent robe embroidered with star-like patterns. A luminous crown perched atop her intricately braided hair, glowing with arcs of violet energy. The moment Zach stepped into the chamber, her gaze pinned him. The hush deepened. A robed priestess approached the dais, staff in hand. Dravarian script glowed along the staff's length. "We gather here under the ancient laws of Dravaria to witness a union that transcends worlds," she announced, her voice echoing through carefully designed acoustics. "Empress Damara, do you sponsor this match?" The Empress lifted her chin. "I do. By right of the crown, I sponsor the union of my daughters, Cyrilla and Isella, with Zachary Cole of Terra." She delivered the statement with regal composure, though she cast a warning glance at Zach, reminding him not to cause any spectacle. A wave of murmurs spread through the assembled nobility. Zach stepped forward, resisting the urge to wipe nervous sweat from his brow. He had about 10 seconds before the vow portion began. If he messed up even the slightest syllable, the legal ramifications could be catastrophic. He cleared his throat and tried to steady himself. The priestess gestured for silence. "Zachary Cole, speak the vow. Dravarian tradition demands it be precise, or the union is invalid." He opened his mouth, his mind whirling with the hours of late-night practice. Carefully, he enunciated each word, forcing the unfamiliar syllables out in what he prayed was the correct order. "By the cosmic laws that guide all life, and under the watchful gaze of Dravaria's storied lineage, I pledge devotion to this union." He continued through each stanza, occasionally stumbling over a syllable, but managing to correct himself before the murmuring crowd grew alarmed. Nerves flared as he neared the end. "So that the bond between worlds may be strengthened, and the legacy of Arvina's crown shall endure. This I vow." A tense pause followed. No immediate outcry. The priestess turned to the two princesses. "Cyrilla, do you accept this vow?" Cyrilla's face remained stony. "I do," she said, her voice carrying the clipped precision of a warrior unwilling to show any sign of weakness. Her eyes flicked to Zach with something between grudging acceptance and disdain. The priestess then addressed Isella. "And you, Isella?" The second princess nodded. "I do," she replied softly, though her keen gaze assessed Zach with reserved curiosity. It was as if she were calculating the odds of a successful union as much as following tradition. A swirl of ceremonial music rose. Haunting melodies played on Dravarian instruments that sounded like they were half-living creatures. The onlookers stood in unison, robes and ornate garments rustling. "Then it is declared," the priestess proclaimed, "in the eyes of Dravaria and Empress Damara's line, a marriage bond is hereby forged." The entire event felt surreal. A human forcibly wed to two alien princesses. Zach's chest tightened with conflicting emotions. Relief that he hadn't botched the vow, anxiety about the unknown future, and an odd sense of unreality about the spectacle. Had it really been just yesterday that he was expecting a routine repair job? Empress Damara stepped forward, lifting a ceremonial scepter. "The bond is sealed. Let all who witness carry this truth. We honor our traditions. Let no one question the Dravarian will." For a moment, her gaze lingered on Zach, as if telegraphing a final warning. "Welcome to our house, Zachary Cole. May you not regret the path you have chosen." Zach swallowed, a slight tremor in his limbs. I thank you, Your Majesty. I can only hope to be worthy of your trust." Somewhere behind him, he sensed movement. When he turned, he realized Cyrilla and Isella had already stepped off the dais separately, each departing through opposite doors that led deeper into the palace's labyrinth. It seemed neither of them wished to linger, or perhaps they wanted to avoid each other's company. Dravarian law might have forced them into a shared marriage, but it couldn't make them friends overnight. The ceremony ended in a chorus of hushed conversation and swishing robes. One of the ceremonial council matrons beckoned Zach to follow her out of the hall. Passing through the throng, he caught glimpses of curious stares, a few sympathetic nods, and a significant number of scowls. He had no allies here, except maybe for the glimmer of interest in Isella's eyes, in the stoic, if grudging, acceptance in Cyrilla's. But for all he knew, that minimal goodwill could vanish at any moment. He was escorted back to the same lavish suite, now fully recognized as a royal consort's quarters. Servants came bearing Dravarian delicacies and quietly congratulated him. It all felt like an elaborate dream, one where the dreamer teetered constantly on the edge of a nightmare. If he made even the slightest misstep, the Empress's wrath would be merciless. That night, Zach found himself staring out through a towering glass balcony at the city below. Dravarian glow orbs illuminated the streets, and the architecture sparkled with the planet's famed violet luminescence. The sight was breathtaking in its beauty, yet he felt a gnawing uncertainty in his gut. His entire life had been upended by a bizarre legal trap. In the hallway beyond the suite's main doors, the sounds of patrolling guards echoed. The palace had become his gilded cage. Perhaps the worst part was the knowledge that escaping would brand him a criminal fugitive across multiple star systems. That left him with only one real option: to live up to his new obligations. As if summoned by his tumultuous thoughts, a gentle chime alerted him to a visitor. Zack opened the door to find Isella, arms folded across her slender torso, visor tinted a dim purple that hinted at an unreadable expression. Two Dravarian attendants trailed behind her at a respectful distance. "Are you settling in, consort?" she asked, voice tinged with wry amusement. "I'm still figuring out which way is up," he admitted. "Your traditions are extensive." She dismissed her attendants with a subtle wave before stepping inside, letting the door slide shut. "I don't envy your predicament," she said. "Cyrilla and I were raised with these laws. We know exactly how merciless Dravarian customs can be. You, on the other hand, crash-landed into them unexpectedly." Zack nodded, unsure how to respond. He watched as Isella moved through the suite, examining the furnishings and the elaborate wall hangings. "You should know," she continued, "I never desired an arranged marriage. Not with a Dravarian noble, and certainly not with a human stranger. But I also accept the law. I believe we can find a workable arrangement, if not an ideal one." Her calm, analytical demeanor reminded him of a scientist dissecting a new specimen. "You mean you want to coexist until we can find a better solution?" he asked. "There is no better solution," Isella corrected gently. "The union is binding. The best we can do is ensure none of us ends up resenting the others so much that it tears the house apart. Empress Damara won't tolerate any scandal that weakens our standing among the other star systems. For that reason alone, you are safe, for now." Zack hesitated, then gave a small, reluctant laugh. "Safe is relative, especially when I imagine Cyrilla's scowl every time she sees me." Isella's mouth quirked in an odd half-smile. "My sister is proud, fiercely so. She was never one to appreciate being coerced into anything, least of all a forced bond. She also believes wholeheartedly in Dravarian martial codes, so she will not raise arms against you unless you threaten her or me. But beyond that courtesy, she may be distant or hostile." He exhaled. "I can handle hostility. I'm used to tough situations. I just need to watch my step." After a thoughtful pause, Isella nodded. "Yes, one false move could lead to disastrous consequences for all three of us. You might want to rest. Tomorrow begins your formal orientation as a Dravarian consort. Rigid schedules, protocols, and endless demands. Plus, you'll likely need to meet Cyrilia for combat training." "Combat training?" Zack's eyebrows shot up. A faint laugh escaped Isella's lips. "My sister is convinced every consort of the royal family must be battle-ready. She won't let you lounge around while conspirators or foreign threats lurk." Turning to leave, she paused at the door, her visor glinting. "Adapt quickly, Zachary Cole. Surviving the Dravarian court is a challenge in and of itself." With that, she was gone, leaving Zack to wonder if his entire existence had just become a different sort of battlefield, one laced with etiquette traps, political landmines, and a pair of unpredictable alien wives. He gazed once more at the violet-lit cityscape, imagining the swirling cosmos beyond. He had always been quick on his feet, but now his life depended on how deftly he could navigate an alien throne. End of part 1. On his second morning in the royal palace, Zachary Cole awoke to the insistent chime of a palace schedule notification. A hovering holographic panel materialized at the foot of his bed, displaying two urgent summons. The first was from Cyrilla, demanding his presence in the Western training courtyard for mandatory combat drills. The second was from Isella, requesting his help in the palace laboratory to stabilize a finicky quantum array. Both were labeled Priority 1, and both were scheduled for the exact same time. Groaning, Zack rubbed his face, recalling Isella's warning that any misstep could bring dire consequences in Dravarian culture. Now he had two sisters vying for his immediate attention. Neither would appreciate being sidelined. He swung his legs out of bed and briefly studied his reflection in a crystalline wall panel. The ceremonial robe he had worn for yesterday's wedding rites had been replaced by a simpler, form-fitting garment more suitable for daily palace life. Its fabric was riddled with microfilaments of living metal, designed, according to the palace attendants, to adjust its temperature and coloration to match the wearer's mood. Currently, it reflected a subdued slate gray, revealing his stress. "Terrific," he muttered, stepping away. His suite's main door opened with a soft hiss, admitting Orla, one of the matrons from the ceremonial council. She offered him a tray of spiced beverages, each steaming with a distinctly floral aroma. "Good morning, consort," she said in that measured, formal tone. "Your schedule suggests you have pressing engagements with both Princess Cyrilla and Princess Isella. Any advice on how to handle that?" Zach asked, eyeing the two conflicting notifications. Orla pursed her lips. "You must choose wisely. In Dravarian households, being punctual is a sign of respect. Failing either appointment will be seen as dishonorable. Yet you cannot be in two places at once." Zach drained half of one spiced drink, finding its flavor surprisingly pleasant. Then he tapped the holographic schedule to pull up more details. The note from Cyrilla read, "Meet me in the West Courtyard at sunrise to begin your combat training. No excuses." Meanwhile, Isella's text read, "Quantum stabilizer glitch. Could blow a hole in the palace if not resolved ASAP." If the quantum array is truly that unstable, Zach reasoned, that seems more urgent. A literal explosion would overshadow tardiness at a sparring session. Orla offered a small tilt of her head. "Your logic is sound, but Princess Cyrilla's summons carry heavy weight. She has always disapproved of outsiders in the royal guard, and she may not see the scientific crisis as more pressing than your duty to become battle-ready." Facing the prospect of fury from one princess or a catastrophic lab accident with the other, Zach swallowed the rest of his drink. "I'll start in the lab," he decided at last. "Better to prevent a palace-shaking explosion. Then I'll sprint to the courtyard." He hurried through twisting corridors, each turn bringing him deeper into the labyrinthine heart of the palace. Guards in sleek armor patrolled silently, and more than once Zach found himself momentarily lost until a passing attendant pointed him in the right direction. Eventually, he reached a set of reinforced doors that led into a sprawling technological marvel. Banks of humming servers lined one wall, while arcs of violet electricity leapt between crystalline pillars. Tall windows overlooked the city, tinted to protect the room from solar glare. In the center of it all stood Isella, tapping commands into a floating display. Her circlet projected a field of data streams around her head, each line of script reconfiguring in real time. As soon as she noticed Zach, she gave a curt nod. "You made the correct choice by coming here first," she said. "The quantum stabilizer is indeed malfunctioning. If its negative feedback loop becomes unbalanced, we risk a localized space-time rift." Zach tried to act calm. "Localized rift? That sounds like a meltdown scenario." She managed a thin smile. "Exactly. Normally, we'd keep the stabilizer offline until repairs are complete, but the Empress insisted it remain operational for a series of power-intensive security scans. We have little margin for error." Gesturing for him to follow, Isella led him to a cylindrical machine that pulsed with an ominous, rhythmic glow. A spider web of fractal lines ran along its sides, occasionally flaring to a brighter purple. Zach examined the readouts in Dravarian script, a skill he was still refining, and recognized that the system was spiking above safe thresholds. "We need to reset the containment matrices," he said, flipping a series of switches on a nearby console. "How do you handle dynamic overload in Dravarian engineering?" "Terran systems typically reroute the energy into a buffer." "We have a buffer," Isella confirmed, her voice tense as a fresh alarm began to buzz. "But it's not dimensionally shielded. If the buffer saturates, it fractures reality in the immediate region." Zach blinked. "That is a critical design flaw." "My sister and I have argued that point many times," she replied, typing furiously. "But tradition dictates that Dravarian systems use only local space folds, not cross-dimensional expansions. Repeated attempts to modernize have been vetoed by the older councils. They work together, recoding the machine's logic to reroute the overflow." Zach's soldierly instincts surfaced, reminding him to keep calm under pressure. Despite the flickering lights and the shrill alarms, he methodically cross-checked each line of code, occasionally consulting Icella's data logs. It took nearly half an hour of frantic adjustments before the stabilizer's fluctuations slowed and finally fell within safe parameters. When the reading settled, Isella released a taut breath. "Your approach was surprisingly effective," what she admitted. "I knew you had engineering credentials, but it's rare to see that knowledge in action under crisis conditions." Zach offered a self-deprecating shrug. "I've patched up plenty of quantum gear in war zones. The biggest difference is your Dravarian console readouts are more cryptic." For a moment, they lingered beside the now stabilized machine, the hum of power no longer menacing. Icella's curious gaze flicked over him, part gratitude and part cautious respect. "Your solution might prevent further meltdown scenarios," she said. "I'll submit a recommendation to the council, though they often resist outside methods, especially human methods." Zach glanced at the chronometer display on the nearest console. "I need to go. Cirilla asked for my presence in the training courtyard, and I'm already late." Isella sighed but nodded. "Go quickly. I'll finalize the repairs here." As he headed for the exit, she called after him, "Try not to get yourself skewered by her blade." With that encouraging send-off, Zach bolted down the corridors, wincing at the thought of facing Cirilla's wrath for showing up tardy, no matter how valid his reasons. Panting, Zach finally arrived at the Western Training Courtyard, a broad expanse of polished stone bordered by pillars that overlooked a cliffside vista. The wind here carried the sense of wild Dravarian mountain blooms. Cirilla stood near the center, arms folded over her chest, radiant in a suit of reinforced combat gear that blended ceremonial artistry with battlefield functionality. A faint glow emanated from her gauntlets, swirling with the same violet energy that powered her blade. 3 palace guards in matching attire flanked her. At Zach's approach, she dismissed 2 of them with a flick of her hand. The remaining guard, Tul, a tall Dravarian with intricately braided hair, stepped back to observe. Cirilla's gaze locked onto Zach, her eyes narrowing. "You're late," she stated, voice taut. Zach tried to catch his breath. I had to save the palace from a quantum meltdown," he managed, aware it sounded almost like an excuse. She huffed. "While I concede that Icella's laboratory crisis could be urgent, punctuality is non-negotiable in the Dravarian court. Remember that." Despite her reprimand, Cirilla wasted no time pressing a training sword into his hand, a more subdued version of her own energy blade. "Defend yourself." "Wait, no warm-up?" Zach asked, startled. She answered by lunging at him, the training sword's energy field crackling with a fierce hum. Zach barely had time to lift his blade in a clumsy block, feeling the impact jar his arm. Cirilla's skill was obvious, fast, precise, unrelenting. Her strikes forced him to shuffle backward across the courtyard, each collision reverberating through his forearms. Even so, he called upon his special forces background. He'd trained in close-quarters combat, though not with energy weapons. Summoning muscle memory, he pivoted sideways to break Cirilla's momentum and attempted a quick counter-thrust. She parried easily, a slight smirk appearing on her lips. "At least you're no complete novice," she commented, ramping up the pressure. Sparks danced between their blades. Zach tried to focus on technique rather than the swirl of tension in the air. Every time he managed to deflect one of Cirilla's strikes, she launched a new assault from a different angle. Sweat slicked his brow. Finally, in a moment of boldness, he feinted left, then twisted right, catching her off guard just enough to tap her side with the flat of his practice sword. Cirilla stepped back, eyes flashing. For a beat, he worried she might retaliate in earnest. Instead, she nodded once. "You adapt quickly," she said, breathing only a bit heavier than normal. "Good, because if you're truly going to stand at the side of the royal family, you must be capable of defending it." He lowered his training blade. "I'd like to protect both you and Isella, yes, but I'm also just trying to stay alive myself." Her expression shifted, just a trace. "Dravarian law thrust you into our affairs, but you have not collapsed under the weight of it. That speaks well of you, though I remain unconvinced of your loyalty." "Time will tell." She turned to the tall guard who had been observing. "Continue training him. We'll refine his form later." Before Zach could reply, Cirilla strode out of the courtyard, her cape snapping in the wind. The guard handed Zack a flask of water, remarking quietly, "Better than most do on their first day. She rarely acknowledges a hit in training." Zack gulped from the flask, chest still pounding. "Thanks." He glanced at the courtyard's edge, where the view extended into a dizzying drop. Dravarian architecture often had minimal railings, placing faith in personal reflexes. Perhaps it symbolized their entire culture. Only the strong or the quick survive in such an environment. Steadying his breath, he prepared to practice with the guard, determined to show Cyrilla and everyone else that he could handle the role forced upon him. In the weeks that followed, Zack fell into a rigorous routine. His mornings began with physical training, sparring under Cyrilla's uncompromising eye. She pushed him to integrate Dravarian martial styles into the more conventional Terran combat forms he had mastered. Afternoons were devoted to assisting Isella in her labyrinth of labs. Under her guidance, he delved deeper into the intricacies of Dravarian quantum tech, analyzing glitchy subroutines or repairing advanced energy grids. At first, the schedule seemed impossibly grueling, but Zack found a strange satisfaction in it. The challenge of juggling two demanding princesses sharpened his senses. With Cyrilla, he discovered a shared love of tactical precision. Her battlefield instincts resonated with his special forces training, creating a reluctant mutual respect. With Isella, he unlocked a new level of engineering insight. Her brilliance was intimidating, but she never treated him like a fool once she realized he could follow her theoretical leaps. Nevertheless, palace life was far from peaceful. Zack began noticing subtle anomalies. Guard rotations posted at odd intervals, storage rooms with tampered locks, and hush-hush orders for restricted shipments leaving the city's starport late at night. Something about these discrepancies felt off, suggesting sabotage or espionage. He mentioned them to both Cyrilla and Isella, but neither seemed fully alarmed, at least not at first. Dravarian politics are rife with small power plays, Isella told him one evening, barely looking up from a shimmering tablet. It might be some low-level council member angling for better resources or a personal feud. Cyrilla, however, grew more troubled the more evidence Zack found. "Our mother, Empress Damara, might suspect something larger," she confided after one training session. "Yet she's kept us in the dark before. It's not uncommon for her to handle threats quietly, lest they spark a panic or invite opportunistic rivals." To Zack, the number of oddities only grew. One night, while returning late from the WEMS, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a masked figure tampering with a hallway security panel. By the time he reached the spot, the intruder had vanished. Checking the panel's logs, he found them partially wiped. Another time, an entire wing of the palace experienced a puzzling power outage, leaving advanced sensors offline for nearly an hour. The tension spiked when, during a scheduled combat drill, one of the practice drones malfunctioned, its safety inhibitors disabled. Instead of harmless, stun pulses, it fired lethal energy bolts in Cyrilla's direction. Zack barely managed to tackle her behind a series of stacked crates. The drone battered those crates until Isella, alerted by the commotion, arrived and deactivated it with an emergency override. Later, examining the drone's code, Zack identified a deliberate insertion of malicious commands. "Somebody rigged it to use real firepower," he told the sisters, worry creasing his brow. "They wanted you dead, Cyrilla." The princess set her jaw, anger burning in her eyes. "No more ignoring this. We have an enemy in our midst, and I won't be made a fool." Yet as they dug deeper into the drone's sabotage logs, they discovered that the coding had been authorized by high-level palace credentials, ones typically granted only to the royal family or their closest confidants. The implications were staggering. "This must be bigger than petty infighting," Isella said grimly. "Someone close to us is plotting something catastrophic." Empress Damara remained an enigma throughout these unsettling events. She continued to host grand banquets and oversee political negotiations with various Dravarian allies, never revealing any overt sign of distress. To many in the palace, life seemed to proceed as normal. However, Zack's instincts told him that the Empress was far too intelligent to be unaware of sabotage attempts against her daughters. If she suspected treachery from within, she might be playing a careful, strategic game, waiting for the traitors to expose themselves more fully before striking. Zack tried to glean what he could. In conversation with older palace attendants, he learned that political upheavals within the Dravarian court often stemmed from intense clan rivalries. More than once, a disfavored cousin or aunt had tried to seize power through lethal machinations. Dravarian law, ironically, made such coup attempts easier to conceal. After all, the labyrinth of legal precedents around marriage and inheritance could be twisted by the cunning. Privately, Zack wondered if his own forced marriage was partly orchestrated by Empress Damara to serve some hidden purpose. Perhaps having a Terran outsider in the mix helped disrupt the usual courtly alliances. It might explain why she had accepted the union so quickly, ensuring he stayed close to Cirilla and Isella, strengthening their bond just when an adversary might expect them to remain at odds. But if it was a strategy, they still had a conspiracy to unravel. Zack, Cirilla, and Isella began meeting secretly in the labs after midnight, speaking in hushed tones while scanning palace data logs. They charted strange coincidences, like shipments labeled food supplies that weighed far too little, or encrypted comm transmissions bouncing between local satellites at odd hours. Bit by bit, they saw the outline of something bigger, a systematic plan targeting the sisters for assassination, and if that failed, evidently prepared to go after the Empress herself. "It makes no sense unless the goal is to fracture the royal house," Cirilla said, pacing the lab's main console room. The faint glow from her training armor accentuated her tension. "Killing me might eliminate a direct heir, but Isella and I are both still below Mother in the line of succession." "But if Mother dies as well," Zack pointed out grimly, "you both become primary heirs. If you're also out of the picture," Isella finished for him, "someone else could claim the throne, a more distant relative or an ambitious council member, possibly one who's already forged alliances with external factions. It's almost a textbook coup scenario." Shadows flickered on the laboratory walls as the city's evening lights dimmed for night cycle. Zack took a moment to gather his thoughts. "We should warn Empress Damara directly," he said. "Let her know how serious this is." Cirilla seemed torn. "I suspect she's aware, but we need proof. When we bring accusations to the Empress, we can't be half certain or she'll dismiss it, claiming it's insufficient. She would want incontrovertible evidence, not speculation, to justify cracking down on a high-ranking traitor." Isella lowered herself onto a stool, pressing fingertips to her temples. "We need a name, or at least a clear chain of evidence. Otherwise, whoever is behind this will vanish back into the shadows." The late-night discussion left them all unsettled. They were close to connecting the final dots, but the identity of the traitor remained elusive. The sabotage logs were cunningly scrubbed or routed through multiple proxy signatures. Whoever was orchestrating these attacks had deep knowledge of the palace's technology and operational structure, a resourceful enemy indeed. The break came unexpectedly. Late one afternoon, as Zack was concluding a more routine engineering task, a harried palace steward rushed into Isella's lab. "Princess, there's been an explosion in the sub-level storage area," the steward exclaimed. "Some of our advanced prototypes are in danger. There's smoke, potential radiation leaks." Isella immediately pulled up an emergency overlay on her circlet. "Which prototypes exactly?" "The quantum inductor you were experimenting with, and also some new defense drones." Zack's heart pounded. He exchanged a significant look with Isella, both recalling how a defense drone had nearly killed Cirilla. "Let's go," she said, grabbing a handheld device for scanning radiation levels. "Zack, come with me." They raced through service corridors beneath the palace, where the air grew noticeably stale and hot. The sub-level was an industrial zone of pipes, conduits, and massive storage crates. Thick clouds of acrid smoke billowed near the far end of a large workshop area. Several Dravarian workers coughed in the haze, stumbling away from a half-collapsed wall. Zack quickly sealed his mouth and nose with a small filter device Isella tossed him. The sound of crackling flames and hiss of ruptured coolant lines made the space feel like a war zone. "Stay back," a guard shouted, but Isella ignored the warning, forging ahead to the control panel. She typed in override codes to shut off the compromised power flows. "Zack, help me move these crates," she called out, pointing to a stack that threatened to topple. "We need to access the stabilizer behind them, or the meltdown could spread." As he and two guards heaved the crates aside, Zack glimpsed something odd, a small disc-shaped device attached to the back of a heavy shipping container. It emitted a faint purple glow, reminiscent of the sabotage device he'd found on the training drone. He signaled to Isella. Another sabotage module, he shouted over the clamor. She hurried to examine it, her circlet feeding her a cascade of data. This isn't just sabotage, it's a timing device set to trigger the explosion at a precise moment. With nimble fingers, she tried to disarm it. I can't fully deactivate it, she muttered in alarm. The triggers are booby-trapped. We have less than 3 minutes before this entire sublevel is leveled. Without hesitation, Zack turned to the half-collapsed wall they had just passed, noticing that part of it led into an older ventilation shaft. We can remove it from the palace, he said, voice resolute. If we hurry. The device was fused to the container, so the only option was to push the entire crate into the shaft and hope it landed in a sealed subterranean pit, where it could detonate harmlessly. Summoning adrenaline-fueled strength, Zack and the guards wedged metal rods beneath the crate and began levering it toward the caved-in opening. Sparks and bits of rubble rained down, and the heat was intense. Isella counted down each second, tension in her voice. 30, 29. At last, they angled the crate sufficiently that it tipped into the shaft, vanishing into darkness. The thunderous crash below made them cringe, but Isella's circlet beeped with a reading that indicated the explosion's epicenter was now well underground. She shielded her face as a muted blast rumbled through the floor, shaking the sublevel, but leaving the area intact. When the dust settled, the sabotage device was gone, and the worst of the meltdown threat had dissipated. Gasping for air, Zack locked eyes with Isella, who looked equally shaken. We can't keep stumbling onto these bombs at the last second, he rasped. We need to go on the offensive. Both princesses reached the same conclusion independently. They had to confront Empress Demara and demand action. That evening, the trio marched to the Empress's private wing, an ornate corridor guarded by 2 silent Dravarian sentinels and lined with tall windows that reflected the swirling star fields beyond. The guards stepped aside at once, perhaps sensing the undeniable urgency radiating from Cirilla and Isella. Within the Empress's receiving chamber, they found Demara seated at a polished onyx table, reviewing star charts. Her regal attire glowed faintly, as though attuned to her pulse. She did not seem surprised by their arrival. My daughters, she said, setting the charts aside, and Zachary Cole, what brings you here at such an hour? Cirilla laid out their investigation in clipped, precise language. Isella supplemented with data logs and details from her circlet. Zack added his first-hand accounts of sabotage devices and suspicious cargo manifests. By the time they finished, Demara's expression remained controlled, but her eyes flickered with a subdued, simmering anger. You have done well, she murmured. I suspected there were conspirators in the palace, but I lacked clarity on how entrenched they had become. Now I see they have grown bolder, targeting not just my daughters, but our entire royal infrastructure. Zack tried to read the Empress's bearing. Was she furious, worried, or confident? Demara folded her hands. Such a betrayal can only be orchestrated by someone with lofty access, she said. Few have the codes to override drone protocols or plant devices in our secure wings. Very few indeed. At that, the Empress tapped a concealed panel beside her seat, causing one of the chamber's walls to morph into a display. Streams of data scrolled across it, showing palace visitors, shipments, and communications logs. Demara pointed to a cluster of repeated authorizations, a set of code keys that had been used to bypass security. Look at this signature, she said, zooming in. The code ended in a distinctly recognizable set of characters, DMR and NA. My sister, the royal aunt, Naamira. She holds a seat on the highest council. I believed her loyal, but it appears she intends to dethrone me, likely installing herself or a puppet in my place. Then we must arrest her, Cirilla stated, fists clenching. Immediately. But Demara shook her head. Naamira is cunning. If we move openly and fail, she might escape with her co-conspirators, plunging Dravaria into civil conflict. She has many allies, some of them equally hidden. Zack let out a slow breath. So this was the identity they had been missing. Naamira, the aunt. What about setting a trap, exposing her plan so completely that even her allies can't deny it? Demara's gaze flicked to Zack, and for an instant he thought he saw a faint admiration. That was my intention all along. I have quietly been watching, compiling evidence. Now, with what you 3 have uncovered, we have enough to confront her. but we must do it with precision. Steepling her fingers, the Empress looked from Cyrilla to Isella to Zack. Namira will make her final move soon, possibly tonight. I have been advised to retreat to our emergency bunker if the situation turns dire. She will expect that, and attempt to corner me there. We shall let her believe she has the advantage, while you three block her escape. They prepared through the night, dividing duties among them. Cyrilla rallied a trusted contingent of royal guards, discreetly rearranging patrol routes and sealing key corridors so no one without clearance could move freely. Isella planted her advanced surveillance systems to monitor every data feed in real time, ensuring they could track Namira's location within the palace. Zack, drawing on his special forces background, helped set up fallback positions near the bunkers, places to intercept any attackers or sabotage devices that might appear. All was quiet until just after midnight, when alarms suddenly blared throughout the palace. "Lockdown triggered," the automated system intoned, lights dimming to an emergency red hue. All personnel moved to secure positions. Cyrilla, already in combat armor, gave Zack and Isella a terse nod. Namira must have forced a manual override. "Confirmed," Isella said, scanning data on her circlet. "High-level access used. The Empress's personal codes. She's either captured our mother or she's forging them," Zack finished. "Either way, the Empress is heading to the bunker." They raced through labyrinthine corridors, stopping at intervals to check guard positions. Some sections were eerily deserted, while others buzzed with frantic movement. Occasional bursts of energy weapon fire echoed off the palace walls. The air thickened with tension. At a junction leading to the primary bunker, they found themselves facing a squad of palace guards who refused to let them pass. "Under orders from Council Leader Namira," one guard announced, leveling a plasma rifle, "all traffic to the Empress's bunker is restricted." Cyrilla's eyes flashed with anger. "You have no authority to block us. Step aside." "Surrender or be taken into custody," the guard insisted. For a heartbeat, they all stood frozen. Then the guard fired a warning shot, a bolt of sizzling energy that scorched the wall beside Cyrilla. "Wrong choice," she muttered, lunging with her blade in a blinding arc. The smell of ionized air filled the corridor. Zack dove behind a decorative pillar, returning fire with a small sidearm Isella had given him. Two of the guards fell, stunned by well-placed shots. Another guard rushed forward but found himself tangling with Isella, who had activated a personal defense field that deflected his strikes. She disarmed him with a swift motion, surprising him, and perhaps herself, with her new readiness for direct combat. In minutes, the corridor was cleared. Zack bound the unconscious guards with security ties. Cyrilla checked for injuries, frowning at a scorch mark on her armor. "No time to waste," she said, glancing to the sealed bunker door at the end of the hallway. A series of muffled explosions rocked the far side, making Zack's heart lurch. If Namira had cornered Empress Damara in there— "Let's finish this," Isella said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She moved to the bunker's access panel, inputting a complex code. The door slid open to reveal swirling smoke, and the final showdown with the ant, who had betrayed them all. End of part 2. When the bunker door slid open, the scene was chaos. Sparks rained from damaged lighting panels overhead, and at least a dozen Dravarian guards, aligned with Namira, were clustered around makeshift barricades. At the center of the bunker's wide chamber stood Namira herself, clad in a modified armor design that gleamed with an unsettling, silver-tinged energy. Behind her, a smaller door led to the Empress's private shelter, a nearly impenetrable vault. Even from across the room, Zachary Cole could feel the suffocating tension, as if Namira's palpable ambition had sucked all the air from the bunker. The moment Cyrilla and Isella charged inside, the loyal guards following on their heels, Namira's forces opened fire. Energy bolts ricocheted off walls and console stations, scorching the air with sizzling ozone. A half-collapsed pillar smoked in one corner where an earlier blast had hit. Through drifting haze, Zack spotted Empress Damara's silhouette. She was still conscious, pinned near the vault door by two armed conspirators. "Mother!" Cyrilla shouted, voice echoing. Her energy blade snapped to life in a dazzling violet flash. She pressed forward, deflecting multiple shots aimed her way. Each parry left arcing streaks of luminescence in the bunker's dim emergency lighting. Isella and Zack dove behind a control console, exchanging urgent glances. We need to flank them, Isella murmured, tapping at her circlet. She triggered a subroutine that caused the overhead lightings to flicker wildly, momentarily distracting the enemy. Go right, I'll draw their fire on the left. Zack nodded, heart pounding. Be careful. They split. Isella rolled across the floor, her personal defense field crackling as a flurry of plasma blasts hit. Meanwhile, Zack slipped along the bunker's perimeter, hugging the shadows behind half-toppled crates. If he could get close enough to disable Naymira's bodyguards, Cirilla might cut a path to free the Empress. Ahead, a Dravarian soldier pivoted, spotting Zack's movement. The soldier snapped his rifle up, but Zack was faster. He fired his sidearm twice, each bolt catching the guard in a protective chest plate. Stunned, the guard went down, leaving a gap in Naymira's front line. Cirilla seized the opportunity. With a fierce cry, she vaulted over the barricade in a graceful arc, her blade slicing through the air. Sparks showered as two more saboteurs fell under her onslaught. A third rushed her from the side, only to be met by Isella's well-timed shot that crackled with a bright purple bank charge. Now only Naymira and a handful of loyalists remained. They retreated to the base of the vault door, effectively holding the Empress hostage. Stand down, Naymira demanded, voice resonating with authority. Your mother's reign ends tonight. Surrender and perhaps I'll spare you. Don't listen to her, Empress Damara managed to say between labored breaths. She was unarmed, forced onto her knees by a guard gripping her shoulder. Yet her expression was fierce. Naymira, your betrayal is complete. Did you truly think to seize power by murdering us all? I waited years for you to falter, Naymira spat, tightening her hold on a silver-bladed sword. You cling to outdated customs, forging alliances with humans, turning our once proud empire into a laughingstock. Arvina 7 deserves a stronger, purer leadership, without your naive expansions and half-measures. Zack caught Cirilla's eye, then glanced at Isella. Both sisters nodded imperceptibly. They had planned for this. Naymira was pinned at the vault, but as long as she held Damara captive, a full frontal assault risked the Empress's life. Their best shot was to isolate Naymira from her remaining guards. Zack tapped at a small control device hidden in his sleeve, transmitting a silent signal that activated Isella's secondary plan. Instantly, an ear-splitting alarm screeched through the bunker, and every overhead sprinkler system activated at once. Water cascaded in a flood, mingling with swirling smoke, forcing the conspirators to scramble. In the ensuing confusion, Damara wrenched free of the guard holding her. Cirilla lunged, blade raised. Naymira spun to block, silver sword clashing violently with violet energy. The impact sent arcs of crackling power through the drenching water. Isella, shut down the rest of her loyalists, Zack yelled over the din, already sprinting toward Empress Damara to protect her. As the sprinklers drenched the bunker, dribbles of water short-circuited the conspirators' gear. Sparks flew from rifles jammed by sudden moisture. One of Naymira's men cursed loudly as his armor's energy feed sputtered. Isella crouched behind a console, took advantage of the distraction to unleash targeted stun beams. 3 conspirators collapsed, leaving only Naymira and a couple of diehard guards. Cirilla and Naymira's battle raged in the center of the bunker, each sword strike illuminating the drenched chamber with flashing arcs of purple and silver. Their weapons were nearly equal in power, but Cirilla's speed gave her a slight edge. Yet Naymira wielded her blade with a cold precision that spoke of decades of hidden training. The two circled each other, boots sliding on the wet floor. Meanwhile, Zack helped Damara to her feet, supporting the Empress as she staggered. Though her breathing was labored, her eyes burned with determination. "Mother, are you hurt?" Isella asked, rushing to their side. Damara shook her head. "Only my pride," she replied, glancing at where Cirilla clashed with Naymira. "This ends now. Let no traitor walk free." The 2 guards, still loyal to Naymira, made a last-ditch effort, charging from an angle to flank Cirilla. Zack lifted his sidearm, heart hammering. One well-placed shot stunned the first attacker, while Isella's quick reflexes dispatched the second. Their limp forms splashed into the inch-deep water that now covered most of the bunker floor. All attention returned to the lethal dance between Cirilla and Naymira. Cirilla swung her blade in a downward arc that Naymira intercepted. the contact flooding the bunker with a harsh crackle of colliding energies. With grim fury, Namira pushed forward, forcing Cirilla back a step. You can't protect this empire from the tide of cosmic threats, Namira hissed. We must be stronger, more ruthless. Your mother's softness will doom us. You tried to murder me, my sister, and our mother, Cirilla retorted, voice strained. You have no right to speak of strength. She twisted abruptly, maneuvering the two swords into a lock. With water still cascading from overhead, her foot slipped and she nearly lost her balance. An opening that Namira seized. The older woman aimed a savage strike at Cirilla's side, determined to pierce her armor. Zack felt time slow. He dashed forward, ignoring the risk. With a desperate lunge, he shoved Cirilla sideways, absorbing Namira's blow against his own smaller, hastily raised blade. Sparks exploded from the collision, the force sending him skidding across the slick floor. His arms screamed with pain, but the heavier strike had been partially deflected. In that vulnerable moment, Cirilla retaliated. Summoning every ounce of training, she slashed upward, hitting Namira's sword arm with a surge of violet energy. The blade clattered from Namira's grip, skidding across the wet floor. Water and smoke framed Cirilla's determined face as she locked eyes with her treacherous aunt. This palace stands united, she declared, despite your schemes. Namira staggered back, clutching her arm. No longer armed, she glowered at Cirilla, Isella, Zack, and Empress Damara now assembled in a semicircle around her. Her conspirators lay immobilized or unconscious. Fools, she spat. You'll regret sparing me. Damara stepped forward. Even soaked and battered, the Empress radiated authority. Namira, for high treason, I strip you of all titles and power. Guards, take her away. She will be tried before the highest council for her crimes. At the Empress's command, loyal Dravarian soldiers stormed in, seizing Namira and her injured allies. The flickering emergency lights cast their shadows large upon the bunker walls, and the final echoes of violence faded into the dripping hush. Cirilla, trembling slightly, deactivated her blade and turned to Zack, who was still on the ground. Are you all right? She asked, voice subdued. He slowly got up, flexing his arms to ease the pain. Bruised but alive. I guess I still owe you a real sword lesson, he attempted to joke, relief mingling with exhaustion. Isella let out a wavering sigh, placing a hand on Cirilla's shoulder. Then she glanced at Zack, something unspoken in her eyes. We did this together, she said softly. All of us. Empress Damara surveyed the chaos. You've proven your bond, my children, she murmured, acknowledging Cirilla and Isella, then looking squarely at Zack. And you, Zachary Cole, I believed your accidental arrival might unite them, but I never anticipated you would go this far to protect our house. News of Namira's coup attempt spread quickly, though the royal family endeavored to control the narrative. The official statements declared that an internal conspiracy had been thwarted, sparing the empire a civil war. At Empress Damara's decree, those loyal to Namira were either stripped of rank or placed under strict surveillance. In the subsequent weeks, political tensions gradually subsided, replaced by a cautious optimism that the empire's future was secure. During that time, Zack found his life shifting once more. Having risked his life to help Cirilla and Isella, he earned a measure of real respect from both, and from the Dravarian court at large. For the first time, he was greeted in palace corridors with nods of genuine welcome, not just guarded suspicion. Even the ceremonial council matrons now addressed him without their former iciness, although they continued to enforce protocol whenever it suited them. But the real changes happened behind closed doors. The dynamic between Zack and the princesses blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Shared danger often forges deep bonds, and after confronting Namira's betrayal side by side, the three of them found a sense of unity that transcended the forced marriage's awkward beginnings. You know, Isella ventured one evening, as they all gathered on a balcony overlooking the capital city, I used to think your stumbling into us was purely unfortunate coincidence. She cast Zack a rare, warm smile. But I see now it was more like cosmic timing. We needed someone who could balance us, someone not bound by Dravarian traditions, yet still willing to fight for us. Zack felt a warmth in his chest at her words. I never asked for any of this, he admitted, but I can't deny it's led me to a place I never thought possible. My old life. I always felt like an outsider, drifting from one contract to another. Cyrilla stood beside them, still wearing her training armor, but with the helmet tucked under her arm. She glanced away, as if shy about revealing her thoughts. When I first met you, I considered you a nuisance, a liability forced on me by outdated laws. But I was wrong. Her gaze flicked to him. You've risked your life for us more than once. You've honored this family. In time, I hope you'll consider Dravaria your home. They fell into a companionable silence, watching the interplay of starlight and city glow. High above, satellites orbited, faint beacons in the Dravarian night. In the days that followed, Empress Demara formally acknowledged Zach's contributions, granting him an official title, Royal Consort and Advisor. The name carried certain privileges. He now had authority to command small palace teams, and his suggestions on technology or security were taken seriously by the council. He also found himself offering fresh perspectives to the Empire's negotiations with external planets, bridging cultural gaps with tact and humility. Meanwhile, Isella continued her research, refining palace systems to prevent any future sabotage. She often enlisted Zach's help, turning their lab sessions into a sort of intellectual courtship. They challenged each other with coding puzzles or theoretical physics, the tension between them evolving from cautious curiosity into genuine affection. Cyrilla, on the other hand, found her place training elite guards and reinforcing the Empire's defenses. Yet she too softened in private moments, sharing stories of her childhood with Zach and tentatively seeking his companionship. Once, during an intense sparring session, she ended up pinned beneath his hold. Instead of barking a reprimand, she merely laughed, a melodic sound that dispelled the memory of her earlier hostility. Life in the palace brimmed with duties and public appearances, but behind the formalities, the three of them nurtured an unconventional marriage that worked in ways none could have foreseen. They quarreled, of course. Any union involving strong personalities does. Yet each disagreement only reinforced the fact that they genuinely cared about each other's well-being. Months passed in a whirlwind of incremental reforms, subdued conspiracies, and expanding alliances. Under Empress Demara's guidance, Dravaria initiated treaties with other star systems, some of which harbored lingering mistrust toward humans. Zach's unique position bridged that gap, allowing new trade routes to flourish. While politics shaped the Empire's external relations, internal palace life saw an even more profound development. One morning, Isella arrived at breakfast in the sunlit royal dining hall, where Zach and Cyrilla were already trading mild barbs about who would lead the day's palace security briefing. Isella placed a small device on the table, an advanced medical scanner. I've run it 3 times, she announced, her expression uncharacteristically nervous. Each result confirms that I'm with child. A hush fell over the table. Zach blinked, feeling his heart leap. You're sure? She nodded. The readings are unequivocal. The Dravarian gestation cycle is shorter than it might be for humans, but all the signs point to a healthy pregnancy. It's about 6 weeks along. Cyrilla, who generally maintained a warrior's stoicism, looked genuinely stunned. Isella, that's... Her voice wavered. That's wonderful news. Our family grows stronger. Zach reached for Isella's hand, feeling a tumult of emotions swirling within. We'll do this together, he said, remembering how none of them had wanted a forced marriage initially, and yet here they were, building something real. I promise. The revelation set off a flurry of activity. Empress Demara herself was overjoyed, immediately summoning Dravarian healers specialized in cross-species pregnancies. Protocol demanded official announcements, but the Empress opted for a modest approach at first, unveiling the news only to the highest council and loyal palace circles. There were those who might view a half-human heir with suspicion, so the royal family proceeded cautiously. Not long after, another surprise arrived. One evening, just before a training session, Cyrilla leaned against a quarter wall, looking pale and unsteady. Zach, passing by, noticed her unusual demeanor and hurried over. Are you all right? He asked, concern etched on his face. She grimaced, then sank down onto a bench. My stomach has felt unsettled for days. At first, I dismissed it as fatigue, but She trailed off, eyes flicking toward the medical scanner that Isella had gifted her just in case. A few minutes later, the scanner confirmed what everyone suspected. Cyrilla, too, was pregnant. The palace erupted in joyous gossip. Two pregnancies, so close together, meant the next generation of Dravarian heirs would inherit a blend of human and Dravarian traits, a symbol of the new alliances taking root in the Empire. Cyrilla's stoic reaction masked a swirl of emotions: pride at strengthening her bloodline, uncertainty about the responsibilities of motherhood, and cautious excitement about the future she would share with her sister and Zack. "You're forging a new chapter in Dravaria's history," Empress Damara observed one evening, watching her daughters with a gleam in her eyes. "Whatever disapproval might exist among the old guard, it can't overshadow the promise of these children. We evolve, or we perish." Months turned into a year, and soon the palace welcomed Isella's firstborn son, an inquisitive, bright-eyed infant who seemed fascinated by every flicker of light in the regal nursery. Cyrilla's daughter followed weeks later, arriving with a surprisingly powerful wail that made the palace guards stand at attention. Dravaria celebrated, parades were held, and the matriarch's throne grew more secure than ever. Amid the festivities, Zack discovered a sense of belonging he had never before experienced. He spent late nights rocking the children to sleep, marveling at the tiny, exquisite details: violet skin accents, delicate hair, the subtle glow in their eyes. He made awkward attempts at Dravarian lullabies, which drew teasing from both princesses. But none of that bothered him because the laughter shared with his wives, yes, his wives, felt like home. The years that followed cemented Arvina Seven's reputation as a beacon of cross-cultural harmony. Empress Damara took measured steps to include human-influence perspectives in her council, aided by Zack's nuanced diplomatic understanding. Cyrilla's once rigid worldview relaxed into a balance of discipline and open-mindedness, while Isella continued pioneering quantum innovations that propelled Dravaria to new frontiers in scientific achievement. With the royal children growing under watchful eyes, the palace hummed with fresh energy. Occasionally, rumors circulated of lingering conspirators hoping to exploit the half-human heirs. But any such attempts were swiftly quashed by Cyrilla's revitalized security forces. The Dravarian population, once skeptical, gradually grew to accept or even admire the new generation, seeing in those children the synthesis of two civilizations. Within the family, new rhythms emerged. Zack would help Isella in the labs, a toddler perched on his hip, while she explained advanced quantum equations to the wide-eyed child. Cyrilla often took her little one to the training courtyard, teaching basic stances and self-defense from an early age, insisting that even heirs to the throne should know how to protect themselves. Such scenes became normal, an intersection of duty, tradition, and the unexpected warmth of their shared life. Sometimes Zack found a quiet moment to reflect on how his life had changed since that fateful day he stumbled in the spaceport. He still recalled the panic of colliding with two Dravarian princesses and the absurd ultimatum that followed. Yet in the end, it was the best misstep he had ever taken. A single accident, he mused more than once, led to a family, a home, and a future none of us saw coming. On the day the children turned 3, Empress Damara hosted a grand celebration, inviting dignitaries from allied star systems. Cyrilla and Isella presided over the festivities, radiant in regalia that symbolized their roles as warrior and scholar. Zack moved seamlessly through the crowd, comfortable in his position as consort and advisor, greeting old acquaintances and new delegates who viewed him as living proof of interspecies cooperation. By twilight, the palace gardens glowed with lanterns and music drifted through the mild evening air. Cyrilla stood by a fountain, gently swinging her daughter's hand. Isella was nearby, pointing out constellations to her young son. Zack joined them, arms resting around his wife's shoulders in a gesture of familial unity. The children giggled, enthralled by the soft lights reflected in the water. "We've come so far," Isella commented, her gaze shifting between the starlit sky and the bustling garden. "Our family, this empire, everything has changed." Cyrilla nodded, looking introspective. "It's not what I imagined, but I wouldn't trade it. Sometimes the unexpected path is the one that leads to real strength." Zack smiled, heart brimming with gratitude. "So," he teased gently, "should I try to avoid tripping over any more princesses? Or is that how Dravaria usually solves its royal succession?" Isella swatted his arm, but her laughter belied any real annoyance. Cyrilla rolled her eyes, though a soft grin curved her lips. In truth, the family had discovered the value of shared resilience and unshakable devotion. Through battles both literal and political, their unorthodox marriage transcended the original accident that bound them together. Far above, the constellations shimmered like cosmic guardians, a silent testament to the improbable love story that had unfolded on Arvina 7. If fate had a sense of humor, it had certainly shown it, but also a deep wisdom that had gifted each of them a destiny they never would have chosen, yet now cherished beyond measure. And so our tale comes to a close, or perhaps a new beginning. Reflecting on everything from that clumsy collision in a bustling spaceport to toppling a dangerous coup, our protagonists have learned the value of loyalty, trust, and the unbreakable bonds forged by fate. From the quiet brilliance of Isella's laboratory to the fierce resilience of Cyrilla's training grounds, this unconventional family has shown that differences can become strengths when guided by compassion and courage. Today, Arvina 7 stands tall, an empire enriched by human ingenuity and fortified by Dravarian heritage, with a royal family that exemplifies unity. From my personal perspective, it's proof that even the most unexpected obstacles can lead to extraordinary growth. Thank you for journeying with us. Feel free to leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments. Your insights spark the very discussions that keep stories like this alive and evolving. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next adventure.